The chief petty officer watched the armorer's rolling drop tanks across USS Essex's flight deck. It was February 14, 1945. 3 massive 150-gallon auxiliary fuel tanks for each Hellcat. More weight than the fighters typically carried. More distance than carrier fighters were supposed to fly. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley Jr. stood beside his F6F examining the extra tanks. They would launch at dawn. The target was Tokyo, the Japanese home islands. Over 900 miles from the carrier task force, No American carrier aircraft had struck Japan since the Doolittle raid 3 years earlier. That raid had been B-25 bombers launched from carriers in a one-way mission. This was different. Carrier fighters flying deep into enemy territory and returning the same day. The mathematics didn't add up. Not by any previous calculation of what carrier fighters could do. But the Essex carried orders from Admiral Mark Mitcher. Task Force 58 would hit Japan in 48 hours. 16 aircraft carriers. Over 1,200 aircraft. And at the center of the offensive were the Hellcats that would escort the strike packages all the way to the target and back. The drop tanks changed everything. In early 1943, American carrier aviation faced a fundamental limitation. The F6F Wildcat that equipped most fighter squadrons had a combat range of approximately 770 miles. Enough to defend the fleet. Not enough to reach deep inland targets or escort long-range strikes. When Japanese forces occupied islands across the Pacific, they positioned their most critical facilities beyond the reach of carrier strikes. Airfields sat 200 or 300 miles inland. Naval bases hid in protected harbors. Manufacturing centers clustered around major cities far from the coast. American planners needed carrier fighters that could fly farther, escort the bombers all the way in, clear the skies over the target, protect the strike aircraft on the return flight. The Grumman F6F Hellcat entered service in August 1943 with a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine producing 2,000 horsepower. Internal fuel capacity was 250 gallons. Combat range was 945 miles. Ferry range with drop tanks reached 1,530 miles. Those numbers meant something revolutionary. A carrier fighter that could strike targets previously thought unreachable. But numbers on paper and combat operations were different questions. Drop tanks added weight and drag. They reduced performance and maneuverability. If Japanese fighters attacked while Hellcats were carrying external tanks, the Americans would fight at a severe disadvantage. The solution came from tactical doctrine rather than engineering. Hellcats would fly fighter sweeps ahead of the main strike. They would arrive over enemy airfields first and destroy Japanese aircraft on the ground or in the air before the bombers arrived. By the time the slower SBD Dauntless and TBM Avengers reached the target area, the Hellcats would have dropped their tanks and cleared the sky. It worked at Rabaul in November 1943. Task Force 38 carriers USS Saratoga and Princeton launched 52 Hellcats that flew 200 miles to strike the Japanese stronghold. They encountered 70 Mitsubishi A6M50 fighters but achieved tactical surprise by holding formation through heavy anti-aircraft fire. 5 Hellcats were lost. The strike demonstrated what properly escorted carrier aircraft could accomplish. 2 months later, Task Force 58 hit Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands. The massive Japanese naval base sat 1,100 miles from the nearest American-controlled territory. 72 Hellcats swept over Truk at dawn on February 17, 1944. They found approximately 80 Japanese aircraft and engaged in the biggest air battle of the Pacific War up to that point. 4 Hellcats went down. 50 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. But these were still operations against island bases. Striking the Japanese home islands was different. Longer range, stronger defenses, more sophisticated radar detection, and a fight over enemy territory where shot-down American pilots had no hope of rescue. By late 1944, American forces had captured the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam provided bases for B-29 superfortresses that could reach Japan. But the Navy wanted more than strategic bombing. They wanted to demonstrate American carrier power could strike anywhere, show the Japanese that nowhere was safe. Admiral William Halsey had pushed for attacks on Japan since October 1944. The Third Fleet was needed in the Philippines. By January 1945, when Third Fleet completed operations around Luzon, the moment had arrived. On January 26, 1945, Admiral Raymond Spruance relieved Halsey. Third Fleet became Fifth Fleet. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher relieved Vice Admiral John McCain as commander of the fast carriers. Task Force 38 became Task Force 58. The same ships, the same aircraft. The designation change happened at midnight. Task Force 58 sortied from Ulithi Atoll on February 10, 1945. 16 aircraft carriers, 11 fleet carriers and 5 light carriers. Each Essex-class carrier embarked at least 73 fighters. Most were Hellcats with some F-4U Corsairs. Only 30 aircraft per carrier were bombers. The Navy had learned from kamikaze attacks that fighters mattered more than strike aircraft. Mitcher set course east of the Marianas and Bonin Islands. Task Force 58 would approach Japan from the southeast. Radio silence. Submarines scouted ahead to eliminate any picket vessels. B-29s from the Marianas flew search patterns to clear the air. On February 14th, the task force refueled at sea. Oilers transferred thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. The carriers would launch at dawn on February 16th from a position 120 miles southeast of Tokyo. Almost half the air groups would fly their first combat mission. To counter expected Japanese counterattacks, especially from the kamikaze corps, each carrier loaded maximum fighter strength. The bombers would have unprecedented escort. The night before the strike deck crews prepared the aircraft. Ordnance teams loaded ammunition. 400 rounds per gun for the 6.50 caliber machine guns mounted in each Hellcat wing. Maintenance crews checked engines and control surfaces. Plane captains topped off internal fuel tanks, then secured the external tanks under the fuselage and wings. 3 150-gallon drop tanks per aircraft. 1 centerline. 2 under the wings. 700 pounds of fuel above normal loadout. That fuel meant range. It also meant weight. Pilots attended briefings in ready rooms. Intelligence officers showed reconnaissance photographs of Japanese airfields around Tokyo. Navigation officers provided courses and timing. Fighter directors explained radio frequencies and call signs. Some squadrons would sweep airfields. Others would provide top cover for the bombing runs. Still others would fly combat air patrol over the fleet. Today T-0530 on February 16, 1945, flight deck crews began launching aircraft. Hellcats rolled down the deck and climbed into the pre-dawn darkness. Formations assembled overhead, then turned northwest toward Japan. Task Group 58.2 under Rear Admiral Ralph Davison sent the first fighter sweep toward the Chiba Peninsula on the east side of Tokyo Bay. About 100 Japanese fighters rose to meet them. 40 were shot down. Other sweeps found Japanese pilots reluctant to engage. Mitcher had told his pilots the enemy was probably more afraid of them than they were of the enemy. The assessment proved accurate. Japanese aviation had been bled white at the Marianas in June 1944 and during the Philippines campaign. Experienced pilots were gone. Replacements had minimal training. The Hellcats strafed aircraft caught on the ground. They maintained air superiority throughout the day. Follow-on strikes by Corsairs and Hellcats kept Japanese airfields suppressed. Task Group 58.3 under Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman had clear weather over Tokyo and became the first Navy fighters over the capital since the Doolittle raid. The sight of American carrier aircraft circling over the Imperial Palace sent a psychological message as powerful as any physical damage. The Americans lost 60 aircraft in combat and 28 in operational accidents during the two-day strike. The Japanese admitted to losing 78 aircraft. American pilots claimed 341 kills plus 160 destroyed on the ground. The actual number was probably somewhere between. What mattered was the demonstration. American carrier aircraft could reach Japan. The escorts could protect the bombers all the way to the target. And they could return to the carriers the same day. On February 19, 1945, Marines landed on Iwo Jima. Task Force 58 provided air support. The carriers remained on station flying constant missions over the island while kamikazes attempted to attack the fleet. The extended combat operations tested both aircraft and pilots. Hellcat pilots flew multiple sorties per day. They escorted bombing runs against Japanese positions. They flew combat air patrol over the fleet. They conducted fighter sweeps looking for incoming raids. The night of February 21, Japanese aircraft found Task Force 58. 6 kamikazes attacked. 5 were shot down by combat air patrol. 1 struck USS Saratoga, causing massive fires and killing 123 men. The carrier survived but was sent back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The USS Bismarck C was hit by 2 kamikazes and sank. This was the brutal calculus of carrier warfare in 1945. No matter how many fighters you had in the air, some attackers got through, but the statistics told a larger story. From 1943 through 1945, when the Hellcat was in frontline service, only 42 carrier-based bombers or torpedo planes were lost to Japanese aircraft. The escorts worked. That number deserves emphasis. Over 2 years of intensive carrier operations across the Pacific, only 42 strike aircraft were shot down by enemy fighters while Hellcats were providing escort. American bomber and torpedo crews knew the Hellcats would protect them. Pilots could focus on navigation and bombing. Gunners watched for anti-aircraft fire rather than scanning constantly for Japanese fighters. The psychological effect was immeasurable. After Iwo Jima came Okinawa. The invasion began April 1, 1945. Task Force 58 spent 2 months off the coast providing continuous air support while enduring sustained kamikaze attacks. By late April, Admiral Nimitz came out to review the situation. The command staff was exhausted from constant pressure. That on May 28, 1945, Admiral Halsey relieved Spruance. 5th Fleet became 3rd Fleet. Task Force 58 became Task Force 38. McCain returned as Carrier Force Commander, relieving Mitchell, who went to Pearl Harbor for rest. The carriers departed Ulithi on July 1, 1945 for final operations against Japan. This time Task Force 38 would strike the home islands repeatedly. No single raid. Sustained offensive operations designed to destroy what remained of Japanese naval power and demonstrate American ability to attack at will. On July 10, Task Force 38 aircraft conducted raids on airfields in the Tokyo region. No Japanese fighters rose to challenge them. Japan was saving aircraft for a planned large-scale suicide attack. The task force steamed north. On July 14 and 15, strikes hit Hokkaido and northern Honshu. The attack sank 8 of 12 train ferries that carried coal from Hokkaido to Honshu. Without coal, Japan's remaining industry would grind to halt. Then came cure. The Japanese naval base on the inland sea sheltered what remained of the Imperial Navy. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered the ships destroyed. Admiral Halsey carried out those orders. The base had been hit on March 19, 1945 during earlier Task Force 58 operations. A large force of 158 Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, escorted by 163 Hellcats and Corsairs, attacked Japanese ships. No warships were sunk, though several were damaged. 11 F6F Hellcats and 2 TBM Avengers were lost to anti-aircraft fire and Japanese fighters. The July attacks would be more successful. Between July 24 and 28, Task Force 38 aircraft flew thousands of sorties against Kure. The ancient battleship Setsu was struck by 3 bombs from 30 Hellcats near the Japanese Naval Academy and deliberately run aground. She sank in shallow water on July 26. The armored cruiser Iwate, commissioned in 1901, was sunk by near misses that opened her seams. Aircraft carriers Amaji, Katsuragi, and Ryuho were destroyed. Battleships Haruna, Ise, Nagato, and Hyuga were sunk or heavily damaged. The Hellcats' escorts made it possible. The fighters suppressed anti-aircraft positions by strafing. They shot down any Japanese aircraft that attempted to interfere. They provided top cover while bombers made their runs. Japanese naval power ceased to exist as a fighting force. On August 9th and 10th Task Force 38 struck northern Honshu. Allied intelligence believed Japanese aircraft were being assembled for a commando raid against B-29 bases in the Marianas. American pilots claimed 251 aircraft destroyed on August 9th and damaged 141 more. On August 13th, another raid against Tokyo claimed 254 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground and 18 in the air. August 15, 1945. Task Force 38 launched a morning strike against Tokyo. The first wave of 103 aircraft attacked their targets. The second wave was preparing to launch when word came through that Japan had agreed to surrender. The strike was cancelled. Aircraft that were already airborne were recalled. 6 Hellcats returning from the cancelled mission were jumped by 15 to 20 Japanese aircraft. In the wild fight that followed, the Hellcats shot down 9 enemy aircraft. It was possibly the last air combat of World War II. The extended range missions proved what carrier aviation could accomplish with the right aircraft and tactics. The Hellcat's combination of range, firepower, and ruggedness made deep strikes possible. The drop tanks provided the fuel. The fighter sweeps ahead of the main strike cleared the air. The escort tactics protected the bombers, but it was more than technology and tactics. It was the pilots. Young men, most in their early 20s, who flew 900-mile missions over enemy territory. They navigated by compass and clock. They fought their way to the target and back. They landed on pitching carrier decks after 5 or 6 hours in the cockpit. Consider what those missions demanded. Launch before dawn. Form up in darkness. Fly 2 or 3 hours over open ocean. Hit the target. Fight off enemy aircraft. Suppress anti-aircraft fire. Escort bombers through their runs. Protect them on the way home. Find the carrier task force in the vastness of the Pacific. Recover with minimal fuel remaining. Any error in navigation meant ditching in the ocean. Any mechanical failure meant capture or death. Any loss of concentration meant collision or disorientation. They did it mission after mission, day after day. For months, the Hellcat made it possible by being reliable. The R-2800 engine ran for thousands of hours between overhauls. The hydraulic systems functioned. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires when hit. The heavy armor kept pilots alive when Japanese bullets found them. Grumman had designed the aircraft to be produced efficiently. At peak production, they rolled one Hellcat off the assembly line every hour around the clock. Between 1942 and 1945, Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats. By comparison, the Navy could buy 5 F6Fs for the price of 3 F4U Corsairs despite near-identical engines. That production rate meant replacement aircraft were always available. Squadrons could sustain combat operations. Damaged aircraft could be written off rather than expending critical repair resources. Pilots transitioning to carriers had modern aircraft to fly. The simplicity that enabled mass production also made maintenance easier. Carrier maintenance crews worked in confined spaces with limited tools. The Hellcat's straightforward systems could be serviced quickly. Engine swaps took hours, not days. Battle damage could be repaired aboard ship. These unglamorous factors mattered as much as performance. An aircraft that couldn't be maintained was useless no matter how well it flew. By war's end, Hellcats were credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft. That represented 75% of all Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. The kill-to-loss ratio was 19-1. Only about 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat against all types of Japanese aircraft. Those numbers reflected more than aircraft performance. They reflected American industrial capacity, pilot training, and tactical doctrine. Japan could not match any of those factors by 1944 and 1945, but the escort effectiveness statistic stands apart. 42 carrier-based strike aircraft lost to enemy fighters over 2 years. That number represented the Hellcat's true contribution. Not the kills it scored, but the bombers it saved. Every Dauntless and Helldiver dive bomber that reached its target. Every Avenger torpedo bomber that survived to attack Japanese shipping. Every pilot who came home because Hellcats were overhead. The bomber crews knew. When Hellcats were on escort, they could concentrate on their mission. The fighters would handle air threats. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, one of the Navy's top aces, quipped about the Hellcat. "I love this airplane so much that if it could cook, I would marry it." The affection was widespread among pilots. The aircraft handled well. It was forgiving. It got them home. Post-war, the Hellcat's service ended quickly. The F4U Corsair and Grumman F6F Bearcat offered superior performance. By the time the Korean War began in 1950, Hellcats had been phased out of frontline squadrons. Some served unusual roles. In late 1952, Guided Missile Unit 90 used F6F 5K drones carrying 2,000-pound bombs to attack bridges in Korea. The Hellcat drones were radio-controlled from escorting AD Sky Raiders. In 1956, the last operational F6F 5K drone was lost at Naval Air Station Point Mugu during missile testing. The French Navy flew F6F 5 Hellcats in Indochina through the early 1950s. Uruguay operated Hellcats until the 1960s, making it the last military operator. Most surviving Hellcats were scrapped. Some were donated to towns as memorials. A few ended up in museums. Perhaps a dozen remain airworthy today. The aircraft that dominated Pacific skies for 2 years disappeared from service in less than a decade. Jet aircraft made piston fighters obsolete. The era that produced the Hellcat was gone, but the legacy endures in what the aircraft accomplished. The Hellcat proved carrier aviation could project power deep into enemy territory. Not just defensive combat air patrol. Not just fleet defense. Offensive strikes hundreds of miles inland against heavily defended targets. That capability reshaped naval warfare. Carriers became the primary striking arm of the fleet. Battleships fell to supporting roles. The carrier task forces that Task Force 58 and Task Force 38 pioneered became the model for naval operations through the Cold War and beyond. The extended range escort mission became standard carrier doctrine. Fighters would sweep ahead. Clear the air. Suppress defenses. Protect the strike aircraft. The tactics developed flying Hellcats over Japan in 1945 were still being used in different forms decades later. The 42 lost bombers statistic told future naval planners what proper escort could achieve. Fighters were not just for air superiority. Their primary purpose was enabling strike aircraft to reach the target and return safely. Everything else was secondary to that mission. The men who flew those missions returned home to build post-war America. Most never spoke much about what they had done. They went to college on the GI Bill. They raised families. They worked careers. The war was behind them, but they had been part of something remarkable. They had flown carrier fighters over the Japanese home islands. They had escorted strikes to Tokyo, Kyoto, and dozens of other targets. They had helped end the war. The Hellcat had made it possible. The extended range missions proved what American industry, American pilots, and American tactics could achieve when properly combined. The aircraft was just a machine. Metal and fuel and ammunition and courage. But in the right hands at the right moment, it changed the course of the war. The drop tanks gave them range. The R-2800 engine brought them home. And the .50 caliber guns kept the sky clear for the bombers to do their work. That was the Hellcat's war. Unglamorous. Essential. Decisive. 73 fighters per carrier. Each one capable of flying 900 miles with external tanks. Each one ready to escort the next strike deep into Japanese territory. Day after day. Mission after mission. Until there were no more targets left to hit. That's how carrier aviation won the Pacific. Not through single dramatic battles, though there were plenty of those. Through sustained operations that demonstrated American forces could strike anywhere at any time. Through extended range missions that brought the war directly to the Japanese home islands, the Hellcat made it happen. And the men who flew them made history.